As Donald Trump and Elon Musk continue slashing through the US federal government, the American author of Moneyball, Michael Lewis, has gathered some of his favourite thinkers for a new book, Who is Government?, which puts a spotlight on the work of public servants and how the essential business of government makes our lives possible. Well, the journalist and novelist John Lanchester is a contributor to the book, and he joins me now. Hello, John.
Hello, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us. Your chapter concerns numbers, and one particular number, which is the Consumer Price Index, which governments use to measure inflation. Tell us a bit about the Consumer Price Index. What is it? How is it calculated?
Well, it's actually a sort of objectively mad thing, and it's an attempt to sum up the change in the price of everything in an economy. And in the case of the United States, that's 300 million people over the size of effectively what's a continent. And it's everything from price of eggs, the price of butter, the price of milk, everywhere, by the way, not just in one, but everywhere. And, yoga mats in Anchorage, Alaska, rentals of condos in Miami, hunting equipment, concert tickets, everything. And there's a huge team goes out all across the country and literally records the price of everything. And then they track it, but change month on month. And that the end product is this one number, which plugs into all sorts of things like social security, pensions, even things like divorce settlements. And it's an incredibly important basic economic number that takes a colossal amount of intellectual and practical work to produce.
I mean, so while vital, and we'll come to that, you illustrate very well how mad the whole concept is by just saying, if you think about trying to find how much the price of cheese has gone up, like which cheese, what cheese, whose cheese, how much cheese, and so on. I mean, and the idea of doing this for absolutely everything. Did you feel like you were slightly losing your mind while writing it?
I got more and more interested. The great metaphor going down a rabbit hole, but it is rather what it felt like when you started to think about how could anyone even think it's possible to do that? I mean, cheese is just one thing, but it really is everything. And, one number for rent, which is strange in many ways because a number goes in for homeowners, even if they don't pay rent, which is part of, what makes it a slightly strange thing, the CPI. Is that a trailer park in the middle of Arizona? Is it a condo in Miami? Is it, is it a Manhattan duplex? And the answer is, in fact, it's all of those. It's an averaging of all of those and tracked across time.
The inflation basket, the things that go into to figuring out the CPI, has changed over time, right?
It does, yeah. We have an equivalent one here, and it sometimes sometimes becomes a news item. I remember a couple of years ago, there's a one of these flare-ups over avocados going in the basket because of millennials liking it on their toast in the morning. And one of the consequences of that is that the guys who create the CPI, they have to track the price of everything, even if it's not in the basket, because the basket can then change. So you have a problem that suddenly, I mean, it's no use putting avocados in the basket if you haven't been measuring the price of avocados
Right.
for years and years and years. And even the idea of a representative basket is quite odd because obviously people's needs are wildly variable. And then you also get another thing that economists have the boring name substitution for, which is the common sense thing that sometimes the price of something goes up so much that you stop using it, you switch to something else. Beef gets more expensive, you switch to chicken. So you can have this odd thing that inflation goes up, but your personal inflation number actually goes down because you've had to change your habits because of it.
And you kind of say that whatever the CPI is, for any individual, it's always going to feel deranged because it maps nobody's actual experience.
Yes, it's varies from person to person. The Bureau of Labour Statistics, who are the people who put the number together, say themselves that it might not actually correspond with very few people's subjective experience of inflation. And that, in fact, has become a political hot potato, not just in the United States, but everywhere, because even when the headline number in America has been better than it has anywhere else in the developed world. But interestingly, they couldn't care less about that. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting points of difference. I think if it was in the UK and the government had the lowest inflation number, they would constantly be comparing it. Say, look, we're better than the EU, we're better than the United States, better than Australia. There's a lot of language around world beating, that sort of thing. But the Americans just couldn't care less. It's just a subjective thing of how much they're paying. In particular for food, I think that's the one that really breaks through into people's, multiple times a day, people notice food inflation.
Yeah, it was very striking how little mileage the Biden administration got out of the fact that they had among the lowest inflation in the Western world. As you say, nobody cared. You also talk about the misery index. Tell us about the misery index.
That was the thing. A guy called Arthur Okun, who was Lyndon Johnson's chief economist, came up with this number that was trying to basically track how rubbish life felt. He came up with the idea of adding annual inflation to unemployment, and that being quite a reliable indicator of just, the kind of texture of ordinary day life. And an interesting thing about that, so noodled around with it a bit, and in election years, if the misery index was in double figures, the incumbent loses. That's become a rule of modern American politics. The only person to break that was Reagan, but he came in, inflation was nearly 20%, and it had halved by the time of his re-election. So there was this clear downward trend. But all the others, Carter in double figures, he lost. Um, Bush won double figures, he lost. And even Trump in 2020, inflation, thanks to COVID, inflation was well into double figures, and he lost. And the only person to have broken that rule in contemporary politics is Biden. The misery index was in single figures, and yet somehow that just didn't cut through. People didn't believe it. It didn't represent their own experience. He did historically a reasonably good job with it, but they just couldn't get people to believe it.
I mean, well, this is the meat of your article. This question of why it is that the economic data can be saying one thing and people don't believe it. People feel something else is going on. A situation described, you describe as well in your piece as the vibe session. What is the vibe session? It's just that, really, right?
Well, yes, it's a disconnect between what the story that the numbers are apparently telling and people's subjective, just what life feels like. Because any economy in the developed world would have swapped for America's numbers over the Biden incumbency. Just hands down, their numbers were better than anyone's. And yet there was this very, very strong sense of, what Jimmy Carter called malaise, everyone feeling doom and gloom and we're losing. And I think, it does look as if there's been a bit of a shift in terms of the sense of, well, life's a bit hard for me, but actually in general, we're doing okay. That idea has faded, and the subjective importance, I just don't believe these numbers. That's a big part of it. The numbers are rigged, the numbers are fake. There's a whole discourse around, it's a scam, it's a trick, the government are lying to you. Plus, I think there's a particular thing about food inflation. I think, I'm just, unluckily, I'm about to do my car insurance next week. I haven't actually dared open emails yet because I know it have gone up. It always does, but that's something you notice once a year. Something, I've got a foam roller I'm looking at behind my computer that I use to stretch out my back. When that's knackered and gone, but it'll be 10 years since I bought the last one. So, I mean, prices bound to have gone up, I won't notice. But food inflation, you notice multiple times every day. In fact, I noticed the local coffee shop around the corner there, espresso's just gone to £3. I remember grumbling when it went to £2. There's that, you can't get away from food inflation. And even though it's only, in the United States, it's 13% of a typical inflation basket. So 87% of things are not food. But that 13% is very, very important just because you can't get away from it. You can't stop noticing it. It's always there. And I think that was a big part of why it was just so hard to get people to look at the bigger picture.
Well, I mean, hence the American obsession with the price of eggs, even though $9 for a box of eggs is actually not that much for quite a lot of food, but it's a lot more than they used to be paying for eggs. Look, you asked the question directly. You say, what's happening? Is this something to do with the data or something to do with the electorate? The fact that people are not, I mean, appreciating is maybe too strong a word, but not appreciating the relatively healthy economy and making their votes, not feeling it happening. Do you think it's the numbers? Do you think it's the electorate?
I think half and half. I think the numbers thing is the fact what they call non-core inflation, which is food and fuel. Yeah, people really notice those numbers. But I do think there's a shift in our politics, in our culture, towards the sort of subjective sense of what life's like, the story you want to believe, the story you choose to believe, and the story you can, to use my least favorite word, curate. You can arrange your sources of information, your feed of news, your parasocial online relationships, everything. You can arrange it around your own view of reality. You see it. I mean, there's a slightly strange thing happening, I think, with the richest man in the world. Musk has created his own information bubble. You see some of the things he says, and I think perhaps particularly you notice it in the UK because some of the stuff is just so mad. At this stage, civil war is inevitable. Just from someone who hasn't been here, it's crazy. And then posting photos from one of the Batman movies, saying it's people trying to break into a hospital in Birmingham. I mean, there's something very disturbing about the fact that someone who can have access to anything they want in information terms and other terms too, they're choosing to organize a version of reality which is just not real. It's just doesn't correspond with actual reality. And I think the sense in which we can all do a version of that does feed into this sense that, you know, you can't, in a way, it's harder than ever to have an objective number because people just won't believe it.
But you also suggest, and I think, correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but I think this is right, that even that, in a way, is to do with inflation, because at times of high inflation, people have always gone mad. We've just forgotten this because it hasn't happened for generations like this.
Yeah, I think a clear lesson in the politics of the last few years, where basically every incumbent everywhere has lost, with the typical exception of the French, you know, doing it differently just to be annoying. But everywhere else, incumbents have lost the election. And that, I think the number one shared cause is inflation. People absolutely hate inflation. And I think that was a thing that we'd sort of collectively forgotten. You know, when inflation was well in double figures, I think I bought my first flat in 1987, and I think, I can't remember, it was 12% or 14% interest rates, which are in there to get inflation down. And we have sort of collectively forgotten just the sort of deranging impact of inflation. And, you know, President Nixon, when he was in power, brought in price controls. You know, that's a policy from Pyongyang rather than Washington, in an attempt to get on top of them. That's, you know, fairly determinedly right of centre Republican president resorting to those policies. I think we just do. Yeah, people just can't bear that thing of you go back to the shop and you're constantly saying, how much, what?
Mm-hmm.
It does sort of just deranges political culture.
So what's the answer? Is it possible to come up with better numbers, to come up with numbers that are both true and do make people feel that they are representing their experience? Or do people just need to realize that the numbers are true, and the truthiness of how it feels to them is just not that important?
I'm not sure. I think a lesson for politicians and economists is this thing about what they call non-core inflation, because they try and separate them out. Because non-core stuff is stuff that varies in price all the time for reasons which you don't control, which is basically food and fuel. You know, if there's a drought, there's no bananas, and the price of bananas is going to go up, and government can't do anything about that. It's just ditto most of the time for a lot. I mean, it has more control over the price of energy, but just in the short term, the price of oil goes up. There's nothing you can do about it. So they call that non-core inflation. But actually, in terms of ordinary texture of everyday life, you know, things like the price of energy is the price of everything ultimately. And it's all very well saying it's not really core inflation. The government's metrics, the core inflation, but you know, nobody cares if it's having that kind of impact. So I think they could tell better stories around that and about why, you know, the things we have control over, the things we don't, the broad trends. But the actual technical production of the CPI and over here the RPI, not sure there's much they can do different. I really do think it's around, you know, framing and just the sort of you know, getting people to understand that this number that applies to everything that's absolutely essential to the function of government and economy. It's not quite the same thing as this is what's happening in your life.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating and as well beautifully written chapter in a book. Thanks very much indeed for coming on to talk to us about it. Thank you, John Lanchester. And the book is Who is Government, and the article is The Number. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Yeah.